At my uncle's funeral, my own mother stood up in front of 200 people and pointed at me. "Ask him," she said. "Ask Daniel where the money really went." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. My wife's hand found mine under the pew, squeezing so hard I felt her wedding ring cut into my finger. I looked at my mother, then at my brother sitting beside her, with his arms crossed and a smirk he wasn't even trying to hide. And I understood, in that one frozen second, that this had been planned. Not grief, not a breakdown. A performance timed for the exact moment I'd have nowhere to run. What none of them knew was that 3 weeks earlier, a lawyer in Hartford had mailed me a manila envelope with my uncle's handwriting on the front, and inside it was the reason my family had been lying to me for 20 years. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 38 years old, and until that morning in the St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Hartford, Connecticut, I thought I had already absorbed the worst my family had to give me. I was wrong. If you've ever sat in a room full of people who share your blood and realised none of them were ever really on your side, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. You have to go back to understand how we got to that pew. Go back 20 years, to a kitchen table in a small house on Bellwood Street in Hartford, where my father, Gerald Whitfield, ran a modest hardware business that he'd built from nothing, and where my uncle Marcus, his older brother, was the one everybody called the smart one. Marcus had gone to UConn on a scholarship. Marcus wore a tie to Thanksgiving. Marcus was, in my mother's words, what a Whitfield man is supposed to look like. I was 16 that year, working weekends at my father's store, stacking paint cans and learning how to cut keys, while my older brother Russell was already being groomed to take over the business, even though Russell had never shown up on time for a single shift in his life. My father died of a heart attack when I was 19. It was sudden, the kind of death that leaves a house full of unfinished sentences. Within a month, my uncle Marcus had stepped in to help manage things, and within 6 months, the hardware store had been sold. My mother told me the business had been drowning in debt, that my father had been hiding financial trouble for years, that there was barely enough left after the sale to cover what he owed. Russell got a check. I got nothing. When I asked why, my mother said the words that would define the next 2 decades of my life. "Your father always said you were the one who could make it on your own, Daniel. Russell needs the help. You don't." I was 19, I believed her. That's the part that still gets me, even now. I believed her because why would a mother lie about something like that? I left for the Army Reserve a year later, partly to get away from the silence in that house, and partly because I needed someone, anyone, to tell me I was worth something. I served. I came home. I went to community college on the GI Bill, and I built a small electrical contracting business, one job at a time, the way my father had built his hardware store, brick by brick, with nobody handing me anything. Russell, meanwhile, ran my father's old hardware store into the ground within 4 years. Then he tried 2 restaurants, a car detailing franchise, and a consulting business that never seemed to consult anyone. Every single time, my mother found the money to bail him out. Every single time, the explanation circled back to the same place. "Your father would have wanted us to help him. He's struggling, Daniel. You're not." I want to tell you I confronted her about it sooner. I didn't. There's a kind of quiet that settles into a family once a lie becomes load-bearing. Once everyone, even the people getting hurt by it, starts protecting it without meaning to, because pulling it out feels like it might bring the whole house down. I told myself I didn't need their money. I told myself I'd made it without them, and that was its own kind of victory. What I didn't tell myself, because I couldn't admit it yet, was how much it cost me to keep showing up to Sunday dinners and birthday parties, and being treated like the dependable, slightly forgettable son, while Russell got toasted at every holiday like he was one good break away from greatness. My Uncle Marcus was different from the rest of them. He never said much at family gatherings. He'd ask about my business, actually listen to the answer, and once at my daughter's christening, he pulled me aside and said something I didn't understand until years later. "You did this the hard way, Danny. Don't ever let anybody tell you that means you did it the wrong way." I thought it was just a kind thing for an uncle to say. I had no idea he was trying to tell me something he didn't have the courage to say outright. Marcus got sick 2 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much warning, and even less time. I drove to Hartford every other weekend during his last year. More than my mother did. More than Russell ever did. I sat with him while he was on dialysis-adjacent treatments, brought him soup from the diner he liked, listened to him talk about my father in a way nobody else in the family ever did, with real love, real grief, none of the performance I'd grown up watching. One afternoon near the end, he gripped my hand the way you grip something you're afraid of dropping and said, "There's an envelope coming to you, Danny. When it comes, don't let your mother talk you out of opening it. Promise me." I promised him without really understanding what I was promising, 3 weeks after his funeral. The same funeral where my mother stood up and humiliated me in front of 200 people. That envelope arrived, but I need to tell you about the funeral first because that's where everything cracked open. It was a closed casket service, full church, the kind of turnout that tells you somebody mattered to a lot of people. Marcus had built an actual business after leaving the family, a small but respected commercial real estate firm, something none of us had paid much attention to because Marcus never talked about money. I sat with my wife Renee and our 2 kids in the third pew. Russell sat up front with my mother, dressed in a suit that looked too expensive for a man who told me at Christmas he was between opportunities again. I remember thinking it was strange, but funerals make you forgive small strangeness. You don't expect betrayal at a funeral. That's exactly why my mother chose it. The eulogy ended. The pastor invited anyone who wanted to share a memory of Marcus to stand. There was a pause, the kind of respectful silence you'd expect. And then my mother rose to her feet before anyone else could. She walked part way up the aisle, turned around, and started talking about Marcus's generosity, his loyalty to family, how he always made sure everyone was taken care of. I thought it was going to be a nice tribute. Then her eyes found me. Marcus believed in fairness, she said, her voice carrying through that stone church like it was built for this exact moment. He believed money should go where it's needed, not where it's wanted. That's why I have to ask Daniel something, in front of everyone who loved him. She looked directly at me. Ask him where the money really went after your father died. Ask him why he's the only one who ever seemed to land on his feet so easily, while the rest of this family struggled. I sat there with my mouth slightly open, 200 faces turning toward me in a wave, my daughter's small hand tightening around 2 of my fingers, because even an 8-year-old can feel when a room turns dangerous. Russell didn't defend me. He looked almost satisfied, like he'd been waiting years for someone else to finally say the thing he'd been implying at every family dinner since I was 20. I didn't answer her. What was there to answer? I had no idea what she was even accusing me of. I stood up, took my family's hands, and walked out of that church in front of everyone, my ears ringing, Renee's voice low and furious beside me saying, "We are not staying for this." We didn't go to the burial. I didn't speak to my mother for 19 days, and then the envelope came. It arrived at my office on a Tuesday, forwarded from a law firm in Hartford I'd never heard of, Caldwell and Pierce. Inside was a letter from an attorney named Susan Pierce, explaining that she had represented Marcus Whitfield in both his business and personal affairs for the last 11 years, and that Marcus had left explicit instructions for this envelope to be delivered to me, and only me, 30 days after his death, with a condition. I was not to discuss its contents with my mother or my brother until I had read everything inside and called her office. Inside the envelope were copies of financial records going back 20 years, bank statements, a signed letter from my father, dated 4 months before he died, addressed to Marcus, a copy of the original sale agreement for the hardware store, and a small spiral notebook, my father's handwriting on the cover. For Daniel, when he's ready. I sat at my desk for 2 hours before I could make myself read it in order. Here's what I learned, and I want you to sit with this the way I had to. My father's hardware store had not been drowning in debt. It had been profitable, modestly but steadily, for the 11 years before his death. The letter he wrote to Marcus 4 months before his heart attack laid it out plainly. He was worried about Russell. He'd already bailed Russell out of 2 failed ventures by that point, quietly using store profits, and he was terrified of what would happen to the business, and to me if anything happened to him and Russell inherited control. Daniel doesn't need to be protected from hard work, my father wrote. Russell needs to be protected from himself, and I'm running out of ways to do it without ruining what I built for both my sons. He asked Marcus, if anything ever happened to him, to make sure the store's actual value went towards something stable for me. Not handed directly, because he knew my mother would never allow that, but set aside, protected, structured so it couldn't be touched or spent by anyone else. Marcus had done exactly that. When the store was sold 6 weeks after my father's death, the buyer paid nearly 4 times what my mother told me, and Russell it sold for. Marcus had structured the deal himself, working quietly with the buyer and a small trust attorney. And the difference, the real value of what my father built, had been sitting in an irrevocable trust in my name for 19 years. Accumulating interest, completely untouched, completely unknown to me. My mother had been told the trust existed in vague terms as money set aside for Daniel's future, locked until certain conditions are met. And she had spent 2 decades assuming those conditions would never be satisfied, or maybe hoping I'd simply never find out. Because the alternative, me having something Russell didn't, was apparently unbearable to her. The conditions, it turned out, were simple. The trust released to me automatically at age 38, or upon Marcus's death, whichever came first. Marcus had been the trustee the entire time. He'd known every single Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every time he watched my mother praise Russell and quietly diminish me, exactly what was waiting for me and exactly why she was so afraid of it. The notebook explained why he'd never told me sooner. Your mother would have found a way to undo it, or guilt you into giving pieces of it away before you even understood what you had, he wrote, in handwriting that looked like it had been written slowly, painfully, near the end. I should have told you years ago. I was a coward about it because I didn't want to be the one who finally split this family open. I'm sorry, Danny. You were never the problem. You were just the only one who never made yourself one. The trust, with 2 decades of accumulated growth from a profitable real estate-backed investment portfolio Marcus had managed personally, was worth just over $1.4 million. I called Susan Pierce's office that same afternoon, my hands actually shaking on the phone. She confirmed everything. She told me something else too. Something Marcus had asked her to tell me, only if I called within 90 days of receiving the envelope. He had recorded a short video statement, to be shown only to me, only if I asked for it. I drove to her office 2 days later. Renee came with me. We sat in a small conference room while Susan set up a laptop, and Marcus's face appeared on the screen. Thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were the same. Steady. A little sad. Danny, if you're watching this, it means you finally got the envelope, and it means I'm gone, which I'm sorry for. But I'm more sorry for the 20 years I let go by without fixing this sooner. Your dad asked me to protect you, and I think I did that the wrong way, by protecting you in silence instead of protecting you with the truth. I watched your mother stand in front of this family year after year and make you feel small for being the one who didn't need rescuing. I let it happen because I told myself the money would speak for itself eventually. Money doesn't undo 20 years, Danny. I know that now. I should have told you the day your dad died. I'm telling you now instead, and I'm asking you to do something with this that he would have wanted, not to destroy your family, but to stop letting them write your story for you. You get to write it now. I sat in that conference room and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since my father's funeral. Not because of the money, because for the first time in 20 years someone had said out loud, in plain words, that I had never been the problem. I want to tell you the revenge part now, but I need you to understand something first. I didn't come back to Hartford to throw money in anyone's face. I came back because 3 days after that meeting, my mother called me, furious, demanding to know why Susan Pierce's office had contacted her, asking for her cooperation in releasing trust documentation. And she said something that told me she'd known about the trust far more specifically than the vague story she'd given me for 2 decades. That money was never supposed to go to you outright, Daniel. Marcus had no right to set it up that way. It was supposed to be for the family. There it was. Not, I didn't know. Not, I'm sorry. Just the quiet, instant confirmation that she had known, that she had spent 20 years hoping the truth would simply die with Marcus, and that even now, faced with the proof, her first instinct wasn't guilt. It was a demand that I share what was legally, explicitly, irrevocably mine. I told her I needed time to think. What I actually needed was to plan. Russell's latest business, the consulting firm, was hosting a client appreciation dinner at a country club outside Hartford 6 weeks later. The same kind of event he'd thrown twice before to drum up investors. The kind of event where he'd quietly hint at being a man of means while actually being 3 months behind on the lease for his office. My mother would be there. Aunt Helena, And Uncle Bradford, wait, no, that's not this family. My mother's sister Diane and her husband would be there. Most of the extended family who'd sat in that church and watched my mother humiliate me would be there too, because Russell had specifically invited them as supporters of the family business. I didn't crash it for spectacle. I went because Susan Pierce had uncovered something else. In the weeks after our first meeting, digging through the trust's history at my request, Russell's last two ventures had in fact been partially funded using money my mother had borrowed against the house my father built. The same house she'd told me for years was barely staying afloat. The same house she'd implied I couldn't help support because there was nothing left to give. She had remortgaged it twice. Russell had defaulted on both loans in ways that nearly cost her the house outright, and the only thing keeping her from losing it was a small reverse mortgage she'd taken out in the last year, money she hadn't told either of us about, possibly because she knew exactly how it would look. At the dinner, after the appetizers, after Russell stood up in his rented blazer and gave a toast about vision and family legacy, I stood up too. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply asked, in a calm, clear voice that the whole room could hear, whether anyone in the room knew that the family home on Bellwood Street, the one Russell kept referencing in his pitch as proof of generational stability, had been remortgaged twice to cover his failed businesses and was currently one missed payment away from foreclosure. The room went the kind of silent that church had gone silent 6 weeks earlier, except this time I wasn't the one sweating. Russell's face went through about 4 different colours. My mother stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped. "That is private family business, Daniel. How dare you? You made my private business public in front of 200 people at a funeral," I said. "I'm just returning the favour, except everything I just said is true, and you know it." Aunt Diane's husband, a retired bank manager who apparently knew exactly what a reverse mortgage notice looked like because he'd seen one cross his desk for a different relative 2 years prior, quietly asked my mother afterward if that was accurate. She didn't deny it. She just left the dinner early, Russell trailing behind her, his investor pitch in ruins, 3 of the clients he'd invited never returning his calls again. I didn't do that for cruelty. I did it because for 20 years, the official story of our family had been that I was the stable one who didn't need help, and Russell was the struggling one who deserved it. And that story had been protecting an actual, ongoing financial collapse my mother had been hiding to keep that narrative alive. Once the truth was out, there was no story left to protect. Here's the twist I didn't see coming, and the one I think about the most. 2 weeks after that dinner, Russell showed up at my house alone, without calling first. I almost didn't let him in. He stood on my porch and told me something I hadn't known, that he'd actually figured out, on his own, about 6 years ago, that I had a trust coming to me, because he'd overheard Marcus and my mother arguing about it once. And instead of telling me, he'd used that knowledge to ask my mother for advances on what he called Danny's eventual inheritance, framing every bailout as something I would have wanted to give him if I'd known. Money he told himself I'd never miss because I was clearly going to be fine without it. He wasn't asking for forgiveness exactly. He was asking me not to come after him legally for the part of those advances that had technically been drawn against the trust's projected value. Money Marcus had apparently allowed in small amounts over the years to keep the peace. Never telling me, hoping it would stay small. It wasn't small. It was almost $90,000 over 6 years. I could have sued him. Susan told me I had a real case. Instead, I told Russell the only thing I wanted from him was the truth, told publicly, to our mother, with me in the room. Not a courtroom, not a lawsuit. Just one honest sentence. Finally, after 20 years of nobody in that family being honest about anything. He did it. 3 weeks later, at what was supposed to be a quiet, awkward attempt at a reconciliation dinner at my mother's house. Russell sat across from her at the same kitchen table my father used to run his books at and said, "Mum, I knew about Danny's trust for years. I asked you for money knowing it was technically his. I let you keep lying to him about it because it benefited me. I'm done doing that." My mother didn't cry. She didn't apologise either. Not really, not the way I think any of us needed her to. She just looked very small, sitting at that table, and said, "I thought I was protecting this family." "You were protecting a story," I told her. "There's a difference." I used a portion of the trust to do exactly what my father would have wanted. I expanded my contracting business into a second location, hired 4 more men, named the new shop after him. I didn't give Russell a cent beyond what Marcus had quietly allowed years ago, and I didn't ask for the 90,000 back, not because I forgave the debt, but because I'd learned that some debts aren't meant to be collected in money. I see my mother now, occasionally, on holidays, the way you see a relative you've made peace with, without fully repairing things, because some things at 69 years old don't get repaired, they just get managed. Russell and I talk maybe once a month. It's not warm, it's honest, which is more than we ever had before. Marcus's headstone went up that fall, simple granite, no embellishment, exactly the way he lived. I drive out there sometimes, sit on the grass and tell him how the shop's doing. Last time I went, I brought my daughter, the same one who'd squeezed my fingers in that church pew, and she asked me why Great Uncle Marcus was so important to me. I told her the truth. I told her he was the only person in our family who ever trusted me with something heavy and let me carry it the right way, even 20 years late. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I spent 20 years being told I was the lucky one who never needed help, while the people who said it were the ones quietly stealing from me to cover their own mistakes. I didn't burn my family down. I just stopped letting them tell my story for me. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. The truth doesn't need you to raise your voice. It just needs you to stop being quiet.